A thick black liquid buried deep underground is powering almost the entire modern world. Every single day, more than 100 million barrels of oil are extracted, transported, and consumed across the planet. From the clothes you are wearing and the laptop on your desk to the roads outside, countless things around us all begin as crude oil. But the strange part is that freshly extracted crude oil is almost useless on its own. To transform that heavy, thick liquid into the fuel that powers the world, humans have built enormous oil refineries that operate non-stop day and night. So what is really happening inside them? Most people assume crude oil can be used directly as fuel the moment it comes out of the ground. In reality, before massive modern oil refineries existed, crude oil was once considered to have very little practical value. For thousands of years, humans mainly used it for waterproofing or simple lighting. Even after Edwin Drake successfully drilled the first commercial oil well in Pennsylvania in 1859, the most valuable part of crude oil was still only kerosene used for oil lamps, while many other components were almost completely discarded. But then, automobiles appeared. When Henry Ford introduced the Ford Model T into mass production in the early 20th century, global demand for fuel began to explode. And that was the moment humans were forced to find a way to transform this thick black liquid, once considered almost useless, into the fuel that powers the modern world. In the middle of the vast ocean, gigantic oil rigs operate non-stop day and night, like floating steel cities at sea. Some modern offshore rigs are taller than 100-story buildings and are built to withstand massive waves, powerful winds, and offshore storms. From the surface, drilling systems can penetrate tens of thousands of feet below the ocean floor to reach oil reservoirs buried deep beneath multiple layers of rock. When the oil is pumped up, it does not come alone. The mixture also contains natural gas, seawater, and many other impurities. After an initial separation process directly on the rig, the crude oil is pumped through underwater pipelines or transferred onto gigantic oil tankers capable of carrying more than 2 million barrels of oil in a single trip. But even at this stage, crude oil is still almost impossible to use directly. It still has to go through a complex transformation process inside massive oil refineries afterward. Before watching this video, did you realize that a large portion of the world's oil is actually extracted from gigantic offshore rigs in the middle of the ocean? And if you know another interesting story about oil, feel free to share it in the comments below. We would love to hear it. After being extracted from deep underground or from offshore drilling sites, crude oil still has to continue a long journey before reaching oil refineries. For onshore oil fields, crude oil is usually pumped directly through pipeline systems stretching hundreds to thousands of miles. In the United States alone, the oil pipeline network has a total length of more than 2.6 million miles, enough to wrap around the Earth more than 100 times. But for oil extracted offshore, everything becomes far more complicated. The crude oil is transferred onto gigantic oil tankers, some of which are more than 1,100 feet long, and capable of carrying over 2 million barrels of oil in a single voyage. Every day, thousands of oil tankers move constantly across the oceans to supply fuel to the entire world. And the final destination for most of that oil is the gigantic refineries operating non-stop. From the outside, an oil refinery looks like a gigantic steel maze filled with hundreds of pipelines, distillation towers, storage tanks, and flames burning non-stop. Some of the largest oil refineries in the world are bigger than an entire small city and can process more than 1 million barrels of oil every single day. Inside, crude oil has to pass through dozens of different systems where it is heated, separated, cleaned, and transformed into many different types of fuel and materials. Temperatures in some areas can exceed 750 degrees Fahrenheit, while thousands of sensors and computers constantly monitor pressure, temperature, and flow throughout the entire system. And even though everything looks incredibly complicated, almost every process inside an oil refinery begins with one surprisingly simple principle: separating the different components of crude oil using temperature. The most important process inside an oil refinery is called fractional distillation. First, crude oil is heated to around 750 degrees Fahrenheit inside gigantic furnaces until most of it turns into hot vapor. This mixture is then sent into a distillation tower that can be dozens of stories tall. Inside the tower, the temperature gradually decreases from bottom to top. Lighter hydrocarbons rise higher before condensing on the upper levels, while heavier molecules condense lower down. Through this process, crude oil begins separating into different groups such as gas, gasoline, kerosene, diesel, and heavy oil. Basically, the entire system works like a gigantic boiling pot, where each component inside crude oil separates at the temperature that matches its own properties. But even after this stage, the refinery still has not produced the type of fuel that the modern world truly needs. The problem is that natural crude oil contains a large amount of heavy hydrocarbons, while the modern world needs far more gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Because of that, oil refineries must find ways to break these large molecules into smaller ones. This process is called cracking. Inside systems operating under extremely high temperatures and pressure, long hydrocarbon chains are split into lighter molecules with much higher practical value. Some systems also use special catalysts to speed up these reactions. Without this process of breaking apart oil molecules, the world would not be able to produce enough fuel to power billions of cars, aircraft, and ships every single day. After being separated and processed, the fuel is still not ready to be used immediately. Natural crude oil contains sulfur and many other impurities that can cause air pollution when burned. Because of that, oil refineries must continue cleaning the fuel before sending it to the market. Inside special treatment systems, hydrogen reacts with sulfur to remove it from the fuel. Today, many countries require ultra-low sulfur fuel standards in order to reduce smoke, emissions, and environmental pollution. This is one of the main reasons modern fuel is much cleaner than it was decades ago. What many people do not realize is that gasoline does not simply flow out of a single pipe inside an oil refinery. Instead, it is a blended product made from many different components after the distillation and treatment processes. Oil refineries combine multiple types of hydrocarbons together with additives in extremely precise ratios to create fuel that meets different standards and performance requirements. Even gasoline formulas for summer and winter can be different in order to match environmental temperatures. Basically, the process is like mixing a gigantic chemical formula where even a small change in the ratio can affect the fuel's performance. After all of those complex refining processes, crude oil is eventually transformed into thousands of different products used in everyday life. The most familiar ones are gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. But petroleum is also found in plastics, synthetic clothing, paint, cosmetics, tires, lubricants, and even the asphalt roads beneath our feet. If you look around your room right now, it would actually be difficult to find an object that is completely unrelated to petroleum in one form or another. In other words, crude oil does not just power transportation. It also becomes the raw material for almost every modern industry. One remarkable thing about modern oil refineries is that almost no part of crude oil is completely thrown away. The heaviest materials left after the distillation process can still be further processed into asphalt, industrial oils, or fuel for other manufacturing industries. Even the gas produced during refining is often reused to help power the refinery itself. For more than a century, the oil refining industry has continuously searched for ways to maximize every small part of crude oil in order to create as much value as possible. And that is why a single barrel of oil today can be transformed into a huge variety of products instead of just one type of fuel. From a thick black liquid buried deep underground for millions of years, crude oil has become one of the most important resources humanity has ever extracted. Inside gigantic industrial systems, crude oil is heated, separated, cleaned, and transformed into thousands of different products that support modern life. And behind every drop of fuel is an enormous global network of offshore rigs, oil tankers, pipelines, and refineries, all connected together across the world. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is not how oil is extracted, but how humans learn to transform it into the resource that powers almost the entire modern world today. If you found this video interesting, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can join us for the next videos.